Welcome to The Crucible, Conversations for the Curious. I am Hamish, your host. This podcast is for anyone going through awakenings, trying to make sense of life, whether dark nights of the soul, needing to make life-changing decisions, struggling with addiction or critical illness, or simply realizing that their life as they know it is not aligned to values and purpose. You are not alone. You can get through this, I promise you. Life is far more beautiful on the other side. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Crucible, Conversations for the Curious. Today we've got Nick with us, and Nick's got a wonderful story. Like me, he had a dance with the alcohol and things like that, and then he turned his life around, and he's now doing amazing things, helping people with all sorts of addictions, whether it's drugs or alcohol or all sorts of things. So, Nick, thank you so much for turning up here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Can you tell me a little bit about start with your dance with drugs and alcohol and what really tipped you down that path of tumbling down?
Yeah, well, I guess, when I work with people, I always ask the question, what makes sense about this situation? You know, you have people who are doing things that objectively don't make sense, but there's always a sense there. And when I discovered alcohol when I was about 14 or 15, it made sense. You know, it made sense to me. It made too much sense. I remember a kind of a real lightning moment of, you have that moment that all children do when they experiment with alcohol. And it's normally down in the woods or at somebody's house. And there's a patch of woods near where myself and my friends lived. And somebody brought with them a bottle of cider. And everybody had a drink. And I drank. And after everybody else had had a bit of a drink, there's somebody said, well, let's stop this now. And let's go to somebody's house and listen to some music. To which it seemed like an absolute madness that anybody would choose to do that. Anyone would choose to stop going further into this moment, this thing where this huge sense of kind of wholeness came from. It's obviously it is the illusion of wholeness, but this powerful sense of almost liberation from this kind of rather frustrating world I existed in, where nothing really worked out and nothing really was any good. To this other space, it was walking through a magic door for me, and I think everyone I know, all the people I know in recovery, all the people I've worked with in recovery, have a similar magic door story. And it's some people have had, horrendous experiences, and escape from that makes a perfect sense. And other people, they are just kind of like me, and maybe this is true of everybody. I'm trying not to do special and different here, but kind of square pegs in round holes, that life when I was 15 hadn't been without its little traumas, and certainly there would be more to come. But the main issue was that I found myself in a world where that didn't seem to have any kind of accommodation for me at all. If you're someone like me whose mind wanders all over the place and who spends a great deal of their formative years off in some kind of strange dream world, then the world is pretty merciless. And my experience of my teenage years was a kind of this weird, slightly obscured, but ever-present sort of brutalization, from schools and things around you, and the way families work and things like that. The whole of life seemed to be some kind of bat whacking you in one direction or another, and then alcohol, and alcohol in that moment. I think the moment I discovered it weaved a certain kind of magic which was with me for the next 15 years.
Yep. I love the way you phrase that and completely resonate with that. It did something. It made sense. It helped me confidently. You know, I could dance, I could chat to girls, I could actually avoid stuff that I didn't understand. You know, it was a really successful coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's why people do it, isn't it? Because it for a while or a long while it really works.
Yeah.
What was it helping you avoid?
I think it was that kind of shortcut to social functioning. I think, you know, um, the awkwardness of being 15. I think when you're 50, it's hard to remember what that was like. My son is 9 now, and I kind of look upon the next few years with a sense of wonder and joy, but also, oh God, you know. But it's, you know, and you can edit this out. It's fucking unbearable, isn't it? You know, it really is. That period of, you know, I think Eric Erickson called it this called it the psychosocial moratorium, where we, in theory, give teenagers that time and space to become themselves. But I don't think that actually exists. I think I think it's hard to go from that transition from that in that period between childhood and adulthood. I think it's very, very, very difficult to navigate. Um, and yet we create all these means to kind of evade that. And perhaps the discomfort of growing up and finding out who you are, and, you know, becoming an adult, in, you know, at least physically an adult, and maybe people aren't actually adults now till they're about 45, I don't know, but being able to, you know, have, you know, your first sexual thoughts, for example, and navigate that complicated process, to be able to continue with that the kind of, because where you're at when you become a teenager depends an awful lot on how socially you developed as a child, and, you know, were you good at making friends, good at playing with others, were you secure in yourself? An awful lot of people, when they hit the teenage years, the answer is to no to all of those things. So they have to figure it out, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. And then we're spewed into the adult world, and no wonder addiction exists. I mean, honestly, why wouldn't it? I think that sort of answers. But yeah, it was a useful tool. And what did it help me escape? I think it helped me escape kind of a world of not sort of expectations, because I didn't come from a family where there were these kind of hard expectations, but a family where there was a kind of a suspicion of, and a discouragement of, the kind of the imaginary world. I've spent my life as a writer, as a journalist, as a teacher, and as a counsellor. So I've lived in different ways in that world, completely and utterly, ever since I got my first job. And but for some reason within my family, there was this great skepticism towards that kind of, whatever you want to call it, and I found that really, really hard. Yeah, really, 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 really hard. And alcohol was a place where you can sort of create that. Really, you can sit in a pub and be in a dream world for hours on end.
Yep, makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It is that expectation. It is, you know, our parents are our caregivers. They are our frame of reference. And as you said, you had that creativity, that will to write and to dream and think. And, you know, when we're not allowed to be ourselves, we have to fit in. We have to fit in because they are our caregivers. They feed us, nourish us, keep us alive. So we have to stop being authentic to ourselves and start attaching to what they require. I need love, I need support. And, who Nick was, who Hamish was, sort of gets marginalized. And I think it's tragic. It's not
Yeah,
no one's fault. It's just tragic.
and I think that's the process of almost all childhoods.
Mm.
I think that everybody graduates from childhood into adulthood with the love their parents could give for them, and nobody graduates from childhood into adulthood with all the love or all the nurture or all the whatever it was that they needed.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible for anyone to parent like that, you know.
Mm.
And I would, I won't even say that of my own parenting. But um, I think that when we journey through adult life, everyone is journeying with some sort of wound that they acquired in childhood. For some
Mm.
people, it's a horror story. There's, obviously childhood sexual abuse, or sometimes, bereavement, or some sort of major trauma. And I think, thankfully, that's not the majority of people's stories.
Mm.
If it was, then we'd be in a different kind of world. And I think for everybody else, there is some kind of minor, either crisis or a minor kind of crack between the parent-child relationship. I think if parents try to be too much, then you get this other kind of narcissistic sort of smothering parent where mum won't actually go away.
Mm.
Um, and so parents can never, they can kind of get it right, but they can never be absolutely everything the child requires. And part of
Yeah.
the journey through life, I think, is in adult life, the child reflecting on this and taking that responsibility that we all got to take to go, right, well, how do I address that? How do I
Mm.
address that lack, that thing, and fill the hole myself? And the first thing that lots of people do, and they do it instinctually and they do it unwittingly, is that they find alcohol or sex or food or drugs or gambling or pornography or whatever the thing is.
Mm.
And that's how they start off, by self-nurturing. This will make me feel better, and self-comforting. And I think all people sort of do that to some extent anyway. You would, if somebody says, "Well, I've had a horrible day. It's a rainy day. It was a rubbish day at work. Tonight, I'm going to go home. I'm going to watch a movie, and I'm going to get a piece of chocolate cake and a glass of wine, and I'm just going to, comfort myself." You're not going to say to that person, "Right, you terrible addicts. We need to rush you to rehab." Because they're not really. They're just somebody that's reaching for things outside of themselves to do the nurture, and I think so widespread you can probably call that be as part of human nature.
I think you have nailed the most important thing to help people make sense of addiction. I think that is so profoundly important because I think everyone who's an addict and is still alive is a flipping superhero. I
Mm.
found a way to cope. You found a way to cope. She did by that eating. He did by the pornography. Doesn't mean that behavior is okay, but we found a way to survive rather than shoot ourselves, hang
Yeah.
ourselves, crash a car, go mad, whatever. So I love the fact that you've beautifully explained that we find ways to cope
Yeah.
with life. And I think just that allows people to take that shame away, to go, I am a hero. I'm not a insert expletive of choice when it comes to what people perceive. And I think that is probably an incredibly important step in that journey of being able to, let's just say, sober up, to actually look at what we're really facing.
Yeah. There was a story I heard recently, and this came from a piece of science. So it's and it's if you break down the walls between addiction and other mental health phenomena, this story kind of makes a lot of sense. But there were some young lads in a study was done of the mental health of some young lads in quite a rough part of London. I think it was probably the East End, because from where they were living, they could look down the river and see Canary Wharf and all these big shining towers of banking and stuff like that. And these, rich guys would drive past their neighbourhood on the way to work in Porsches and Ferraris and stuff like that. And they found that amongst this demographic, the incidence of psychosis were much higher than in neighbouring areas. So they looked at these young men and they thought, actually, they're not smoking lots of cannabis, which is a big indicator of psychosis. There's not high incidences of adverse childhood experiences, child violence, physical or sexual abuse, or anything like that. On paper, these guys should have reasonably good mental health, but they don't. And they worked out the reason why they don't is because all day long, these are working class young men, often black and minority ethnic, so likely to be poor and likely to face more challenges to access wealth. And all day long, they're being bombarded with images of wealth. If it's not on Instagram, then as they walk, or TikTok or YouTube, it's all around them. They're seeing, Ferraris and Porsches zip past their neighborhoods. And they're being told all day long, if you don't have some supermodel girlfriend, if you don't have some jacked body, if you don't have access to champagnes and private jets and Ferraris and things like that, you don't deserve to exist. You are the scum of the earth and you should go and just cease existing. This is the message that they get. There's this huge society has this huge paywall, and if you want to have any of the things that give you not just fun but value and self-esteem and purpose and worth, then you have to be able to cross through the paywall. And if you can't, then fuck off, go away, stop existing.
Yeah.
And so the psychoses amongst these young men were them essentially creating alternative realities to exist in. Not particularly pleasant or logical ones, because the mind doesn't do that. It doesn't create Narnia for us when we have psychosis. But if you really trace that back to the question of addiction, what the mind will do if it's in unbearable circumstances, it will try to solve the problem. It'll try to solve the problem of trying to make things bearable. Well, what else can we do? And often that is disorganized and chaotic, because I'm not suggesting for a moment that, if you're depressed, going and drinking a bottle of vodka is going to help. But on the mind's kind of illogical logic, that evasion, that escape, is sometimes the only thing it can think to do. It's try to solve the problem of whatever the problem is, umpteen different ways, and sometimes people are just boxed in. Sometimes there aren't alternatives to them, and so flight is the one that makes sense.
I don't know what the answer is to that, because we've got social media. As you said, we've got the TikTok, Instagram, glamour, this, that, and the other. All the lies and nonsense that we actually we forget that we see all of that. And it's taken me till my late 40s to realize that comparison really is the thief of joy. Now, early 50s, I still battle with it from time to time. But it's I've had to work through that. And I guess if you're in your 20s or 30s and life is tough and things like that, it's less important to actually appreciate and realize.
I mean, I would say, and this is not to go down any sort of political route, because that's not what we're really here for, but a less radically unequal society would help. But also, the pedagogies, the way in which we educate people and the purposes for which we educate people, are arguably a century or so out of date.
Yeah.
And you would find, I think, if sort of a regular part of the school curriculum and it is there, but sort of in piecemeal fashion, from primary school through to school leaver at 18, is about just developing that robust self-worth.
Yeah.
And acknowledging that, bloody hell, you know, the kids today, there are huge challenges against them to kind of hold on to and maintain that self-worth. You know, we supposedly educate people in English and maths so they can become economic agents within society and be good workers and all this kind of stuff. But think of the value of, because this is a very unwell society we live in, you know, very, very emotionally unwell society, a very distressed society. You know, if you were a politician and you wanted to add sort of X percentage to the GDP, deal with distress. You know, deal with human distress. Won't make any good newspaper headlines, I'm pretty sure, but that would be, in the long term, a real game changer, I think, and would make us all happier and generally better off, I think. But there you go.
So how do we help people who realize they're in this situation? Because, you know, they realize that this is not healthy. They realize that I am not where I want to be. I don't necessarily where I don't necessarily know where I want to go, but, you know, this isn't working for me. How do people get out of that trap?
Well, when I hear those words from a service user or a client, you know, I'm thinking jump for joy, because you've set out there a huge part of the answer. So imagine, and for legal purposes, I'm not talking about any particular person, alive or dead, because I have obviously done counselling with many people. But imagine somebody comes into my counselling room, and they're feeling they've got a problem with alcohol, and they say things like that to me. They say, you know, my marriage is on the rocks. I think I'm in big trouble at work. I was arrested last week for drink driving. I've got my court appearance next week. And they say, you know, I can see this isn't working for me. Great, brilliant. That's because actually sometimes somebody comes into the counselling room and they can't even see that. They're like, you know, well, my wife has told me I have to come. Well, I can't do anything for you if you don't feel you have to come. Or yeah, you know, maybe I've got a bit of a problem. I still like to have the odd drink, or, you know, I don't really want to stop drinking. I just want to be able to control it more. And it's like, you were arrested yesterday for drink driving. Perhaps that ship has sailed, possibly. But in the first instance, with what I'm hearing is what they refer to as change talk. So somebody's already in this contemplative stage. They're thinking, I've got to do something, but I don't know what. And so then you're in a position to be the collaborative person in that relationship. And you're in the position to go, cool, all right, you'd like to do something, and I hear that, and I can sense the motivation there. What if you and I, as a kind of partnership, figured out what you could do and what's feasible even now? And you start to ignite, hopefully, in that person, a sense that the first big hurdle is change is possible. Because you might have had somebody who come in to you and have seen 3 different counsellors, they've been to do hypnotherapy, they've been to AA, they've rung the Samaritans, they've reached out to their friends in desperation, and they've tried all those things and it hasn't worked. And they might be at the point where they just think, I don't know what it is you could do for me. Nothing else works. Maybe I'm just doomed. And supporting the person to hold on to a little glimmer of hope. You've got to have hope. It's hugely important. And then I think the first thing that normally happens when somebody is working wants to do something about the drinking is that they have what I call the Snowdonia Everest problem. So if you and I were going for a walk up Snowdonia, that's manageable, you know, not necessarily easy, but manageable. And if I said, cool, let's have a go at Everest now, shall we? You know, I don't know anything about mountaineering, and unless you are an expert mountaineer, you're probably going to go, you'll probably give up before you started. So in terms of, you know, if you said at the end of a first counselling session with somebody, right, you must never drink again now, they're almost certain to drink because you've just presented them with something that's, in their mind, their way of seeing the world is now completely impossible. But if you say, let's just focus on today, okay? Let's give ourselves one job. It's making it tonight without a drink. And if that's hard, let's break it down. It's now 10 in the morning, so let's see if we can we'll get to lunchtime. When we get to lunchtime, we're just going to worry about getting to tea time. And when we get to tea time, we're going to worry about getting to bedtime. And that's it. And I want you to call me tomorrow and let me know how you're doing. And they would almost always ring the centre I was working at in the morning saying, yeah, I did it. I did my first day. Brilliant. And then give them so support and reward and show to that person that they have actually just climbed Mount Everest. They've actually done something that they're like Neo in the Matrix with the bullets. They've stopped the bullets and they've done it and they've found their superpower. But I think that it's about the relationship. And I was thinking about this the other day when I was watching the Lord of the Rings show on Amazon. And if you think about, I'm off into some movie analogies now, but if you think about in Lord of the Rings, you should always try to be a Gandalf and not anybody else, because Gandalf doesn't do anything for Frodo, really. He accompanies him. He says, well, it's probably that way. And he also says, he realizes that the burden of the ring is for Frodo to carry. He won't abandon Frodo, but he won't do things when it's Frodo's turn to do them. And that is in counselling is, I think, how you should be. Obviously, you should try not to think of yourself as the wise old wizard either, because the person is actually the expert on their own problems, and But if you place yourself as the powerful person in the therapeutic relationship, then it will all turn to absolute horror, and all sorts of terrible things will happen. So I always avoid that. It's about when you're with somebody and you're, firstly, as they start to divulge their story, which might just be about their drinking, but it might be about a whole bunch of other stuff, things that they've never told anybody. They're trusting you with something that is beyond any kind of numerical value. If somebody trusted you with the crown jewels, it's not as anywhere near the level of trust that this person is placing with you for the first time in your life. And it's a privilege. It's the privilege of my life, really, to be that person there. And also, they're inviting you to come on the journey with them. And so, not only, I said earlier on, hope is the thing that you have to inculcate in the person, that things that can be achieved. But you yourself, as the therapist, have to believe in that person, to believe in them. There's been the odd occasion in a therapeutic relationship where the person they find it so hard to be honest with me that I had to kind of eventually bring that and call that out and say, look, we're not, you and I aren't telling the truth to one another. Yeah. I haven't been telling the truth to you in a way because I haven't raised this until now. And because if you lose that, if you find a situation where you and the other person can't believe in one another, then you're kind of done, really. So that in itself, that little there's two little flames of hope and belief you have to kind of nurture.
Yep. I love that. I love you're holding their hand or you're shining a torch where their feet go next, and it's not up to the top of the mountain. It is literally just in front where the next foot go, as if you're playing in the dark.
That's right, and it's about asking those useful questions that gives the person autonomy and power in the relationship to go, what do you reckon? Is it that way? What do you reckon? Well, what about there? Do you want to go and look over there? Because we can if you want. Yeah. Maybe we should. Sometimes there are things that are too painful for people to or they don't feel safe to explore.
Mm.
And that's cool, you know. The best thing that was ever said to me about therapy is it should feel like a dance, not like a struggle.
It is, isn't it? It's yeah, you're being led by the other person, but you're just guiding them. I think that is. I love everything that you've explained there. But we've started with somebody who has said, "Hey, I think I've got a problem." What about the people who are unaware that, as you said right at the beginning of this little bit, they've
Hmm.
had the car crash, they've got the DUI, and they still think it's okay. How do we bring awareness to these people, or is it just a case of just sitting and watching?
Well, I think also, I mean, it's you believe what you believe. You know, there are certain things in the world I don't believe to be true, and certain things that I do believe to be true. And some people believe in the things that I don't believe, and disbelieve the things I do believe. And each to their own in a way. And you have to say, well, why is the conversation between you and I happening? Okay, you came here for a reason.
Mm.
Um, you've said that being arrested for drink driving, that's not related to alcohol somehow. And that's an interesting kind of. Perhaps we can explore that argument. Well, I never,
Yeah.
but also it's about saying, well, okay, well, how can I be helpful to you? How can I help? And often the person say, well, I don't know. And the point and what they're articulating is, I've got a problem now. Drinking has caught up with me, and really in trouble. I've been arrested. I'm going to lose my job. My wife's probably going to leave me. And if you follow the chain of thought forward, it is probably, and they very rarely articulate this, I was kind of coming here today to hope that you would get me out of trouble somehow.
Mm.
And it's like, well, when I thought of myself as Gandalf, I didn't actually mean wizard, I don't actually do magic. Because but it's like, well, actually, you have to experience the trouble. You have to be in the discomfort. You have to experience that life will bring consequences to you. And, for drink driving with very good reason, fortunately.
Mhm.
Um, and I can't, and it's not the therapist's role. And here's where you have to really check your boundaries and look at how you starting to collaborate with this person actually against themselves. Because if you did something miraculously to help get this person off the hook, what happens then? What are the
Mm.
consequences of that? Are you helping or harming?
Mm.
Um, and it can be very easy to become kind of collaborative in a negative way with somebody when they're coming to you to ask you for things which are actually ultimately harmful to them. And so you have to really watch that one. And I think it's easiest to say, well, look, there is a finite amount without your buy-in, because this only works if there's a partnership here. Without your
Yeah.
buy-in,
Mm.
there's a finite amount I can do. And if they are not at that stage where they recognise that alcohol's a problem, because you do, you as the person can see is blatantly obvious. But what I can
Yep.
see is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what I can see. It's about what they can see. So bring it down. Say, life's hard for you. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Tell me about yourself and get to know them. And gradually, as they tell their story, you'll find where alcohol or drugs or whatever else it is exists within the story.
Mm.
And you'll find out, just as if you were reading a novel and you find there's an interesting character on page 2. By the time you get to page 200, you know a heck of a lot about this character. And alcohol is like a character, addiction is a character in the story that's played all sorts of roles and has sometimes been a good guy and sometimes been a villain.
Mm.
And at the end of the conversation, often the person can reflect a little and see the character in the story, perhaps a bit of the way that you see the character in the story. And I think that's a helpful, empowering place. But you can't want for people things they don't want for themselves, which sounds like an obvious thing to say.
Mm.
And sometimes people I've talked to have been exactly as the case study I described. And, unfortunately, bad things do happen as a result. Further, crises occur until eventually that individual says, "Do you know what? I think you're right, and maybe I do need some help."
Mm.
And sometimes I believe this idea of the kind of the 11th person. And if you imagine that there's somebody and they have, from the ages of, like me, so 15 to 30, say, in that year, in that 15-year period, let's say there are 10 help points that I reached. A telephone helpline, a school counsellor, a particularly enlightened friend. And each of those help points, they go, "I think you need to do something about your drinking." And it's not the 10th, but it's the 11th person that says, "Right, you do need to do something about your drinking." And finally, the penny drops and I do something about my drinking. Right. Well, the people from 1 to 10 are all just are as useful as the 11th person. Because what they do is they're handing on in helping ways the problem to the from the 5th to the 6th to the 7th to the 8th person. And so they're all really, really important in the chain. And you as a therapist might be the 5th person, and it depends how that person leaves you, whether or not they'll find the 6th, whether or not they'll find the 7th.
Mm.
Because if they're supported and helped bit by bit, the chances of them getting there in the end are pretty good.
Yeah.
And a bad therapist or somebody that says, shall we say, things that are really, really counterproductive, they might end the chain.
That's harrowing. I'm sorry, I got goosebumps, and I'm not sure whether they're good or bad. I haven't quite worked that one out. But I like that. It's not denial. It's nothing as harsh as that. It's just curious, curious, curious. Actually, it's that, isn't it? It's curious, curious, because normally they're going downhill, and then
Yeah.
I've actually got to take some accountability for my life. I've actually got to take some responsibility for my life, for those around me, my peers, my friends, my partners, work, whatever. If I don't show up, the consequences are.
Yeah.
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 And it's that simple, isn't it? It's just your journey. It's just your journey, one's journey of life, and then deciding whether you want to change or not. Right back to the
Yeah.
beginning, change.
Yeah. And it's about, I mean, the basic principles of somebody feeling accepted and valued and judged and not unjudged, obviously. Sorry. When they're in the space, and seen for the hurting human being that they are, and not the problem that probably lots of other people think that they are.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? It's not seeing the behavior. It's seeing the person behind it and understanding that appalling behavior is based on insecurity, on fear, on regret, on shame. Because when I look back at me, I was obviously drinking, I was lying, I was being generally horrible, but all those things, right back to the beginning, they were coping strategies, so I didn't have to feel, so I didn't have to experience what was too overwhelming. However, it was damaging my relationships at work, personal, and things like that. It was the consequences stacked up. As I went downhill, the consequences went up, and it got to that point where I had two choices. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And the unfortunately, I often wish, is there not a kind of a kinder, gentler way to deal with addiction? But often it's the consequences. And I did this radio phone in years ago on here in Wales, on Radio Wales, about, it was some kind of new employment law about mandatory breathalyzation at work or something like that. And I have mixed views about that. I think in certain jobs, train driving and things like that, you just have to have it.
Yep.
In certain roles, I think it's kind of oppressive and unnecessary. But the conversation went, and the presenters that said, well, if you found out that your colleague was drink driving at work or turning up to work drunk on the job, would you tell on them? I was like, well, I wouldn't put it like that. I think, firstly, everybody in a situation needs to know the truth for the most part. And I think once you start covering for somebody, then you're collaborating in their self-harm. And you're compromised as well, and all this kind of stuff. And one of the interviews was like, "Oh yes, but you might harm them, you might tip them over the edge," and it was this basic lack of. And I don't blame anybody, because you sort of have to be in this field and have walked this walk to get what I'm talking about. But that shielding that colleague who has an alcohol problem or an addiction problem from the consequences of their own behaviours is not help. It's collaborating in their harm, and sometimes the hard stuff needs to happen.
Yep. It isn't it. It must be brutal for a mum or a dad whose teenager has got a drinking problem or a drug problem, because you love them, you want to support them, and giving them 50 quid for food is not the right answer. You're enabling.
Yeah.
And then kicking them out. I mean, I'm on one or two forums where this is what's happening: kicking out spouses, kicking out children. I am so grateful I'm never going to be in that situation. But I mean, it must just be appalling. But you've got to do something. If they're not going to look after themselves, then I don't know what the answer is.
Well, I've run a family group for family members, which is obviously different from family therapy, but it's a family support group for many years. And there have been a number of occasions where, particularly an adult child has to be forcibly ejected from the home.
Yeah.
And it's horrible. It's make no mistake, it is a horrible procedure. But if you have an adult child with a drug problem, when say a gambling issue, who's stealing from the family, and whom red line after red line after red line has been placed down, and the purpose of breaking through those red lines is to go, haha, your boundaries mean nothing. And maybe it's been quite a boundaryless childhood, you never know. And sometimes it's just been a case of organising the family, mum and dad and the other siblings, to stand as one and say, enough now. If you break this red line, if you steal from the family, if you assault a family member, then you're homeless. And there's and sometimes when you do that, the person for the first time who's got the problem has to confront the problem. Right, I'm going to live. Well, you're going to have to figure that out now. And then they start looking at the consequences that addiction is causing them. And sometimes family relations never quite return to something kind of amicable. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's what addiction does in families. It's not nice.
Yeah, it's not. It's that simple, isn't it? It's not sanitized. It's not easy. It's not clean. It is just a mess. It is a mess, and the result of not taking accountability, not being able to. I mean, I'm not trying to portion blame here, because it's not as simple as that. It's just, it's what's happened, isn't it? I suppose you can't really look back and say, if you did this, if you did that, doesn't help.
Yeah.
It's going forwards. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
This has been a fabulous conversation. I want to dive in very quickly because you've talked about you had a problem with alcohol. How did you realize that it was a problem, and how did you get out of it? Because I think where you are now, helping people, supporting people, you've had that experience. But what got you to that point? What was that point where you had, let's say, two choices? And how did you make sense going forwards there?
Well, I would say that probably from the age of about 20, for about 10 years, I had a succession of pretty huge kind of, about every couple of years, a fairly huge alcohol crisis, a mental health crisis. Um, and what alcohol does is, or what addiction does, is it's very good at sweeping things under the carpet. So you have a period. I had a period, say, at the end of my university days, where I essentially had kind of complete kind of mental breakdown, and I'd admitted myself to a psychiatric hospital um, for and was diagnosed with alcohol-induced anxiety. I only got to see those medical notes years later, and it would have been probably quite helpful to have seen the doctor's write up there. And then I kind of went home, and addiction is this weird thing where you can sort of look at face value and go, "That was pretty bad." Yeah. What caused it? Oh, I don't know. What could it be? Anyway, let's move on. You know,
Yeah,
addiction works, I think, in the way that collectively we look at climate change. You think, pretty bad hurricane. Yeah, I know, but what could have caused it? Oh, well, all sorts of things. Wind, I don't know. Anyway, let's move on. And then addiction is all about trying to return to this kind of illusion of normality, and it's about trying to return to the illusion of the normal drinker or the normal cannabis user or gambler or whatever else it is. I can handle this. And whenever I think human beings do this in all sorts of different ways. When crises come along, we have to sort of kid ourselves that the things that we do and the systems that we use kind of function, and everyone stop looking at it now. Um, and it when I was about 27, I think I got fired from my first job due to my drinking. And at that point, it was that for a moment there, I got close to getting well. But when I was confronted, particularly by my parents, about my drinking, um, I worked overtime. I worked, if you think of like a moment in your life where you put 110% of effort and focus into one thing, whether it's setting up a business or learning how to play Purple Haze or whatever it is, you did it and you pulled it off and it meant so much to you. I did that to save my drinking, and I saved it. And if you think about the meaning of alcoholism there, my life had fallen apart for about the third or the fourth time. And yet, it was important for me to go to any lengths, to tell any lie, any deception, anything at all to save my drinking. To particularly prevent my family from really understanding. And to lie to kid them, to use them and to kid them into helping me to return to the normalcy of supposed sensible drinking again. But the reality was I didn't want to be a sensible drinker. No alcoholic does. I mean, I remember one night when I was at university, a friend of mine saying, who I think must have known I had a drinking problem, why don't we just go down to the pub down the road and we'll just have one drink and come home? And I thought, because that would be a torture. That'd be like gouging out one of my eyes. I mean, why would you do that to me? So, anyway, so about 2 years after I'd been fired from this job as the newspaper journalist, and what they say about newspaper journalists, I don't know whether it's true now, but certainly then it was an alcoholic's career. A friend of mine who was, I won't talk about this person too much because they're not, I don't want to talk about them too much. But they were an old friend of mine who was also an alcoholic, and we'd done a lot of drinking together in my newspaper days. They did something else. They got themselves into way more trouble. They were sort of on kind of page 3 of some national newspapers for some of the things they'd done with their drinking, and they wound up in rehab. And this wonderful friend of mine, who I love to the bottom of my heart, the first thing he did when he got out of rehab was he rang me up. And I thought I kind of knew this was a phone call I should avoid. I kind of knew, sometimes alcoholics have a sixth sense about things. I think it's what keeps alcoholics alive, actually. But I knew something was up about this phone call. And so I started to kind of waffle and fill the spaces with noise and blather on and tried to say to him, oh, how are you? And, how are you doing? And, oh, yes, you need to sort your drinking out. And he just went, will you shut up? And he said, shut up. You are an alcoholic. And I don't know what it was about that moment. Maybe in a different timeline, I missed that moment in some other parallel universe. But when I was able just to go, I could just blurt it out and just say, I know. Yeah, I know. And the relief then of going, finally, I've said it. Because that's a word you can't put away again, isn't it? Bit of a problem with my drinking. Drink a bit too much. That's you can survive that. The A word, you can't. And that was the beginning. And that was in 2004. And in April 2004. And it took me another couple of months finally to embrace recovery. So I sort of had a few weeks here and a drink there, and a few weeks there and a drink there. And then finally I went to AA. And I don't go to AA. I went there for about 5 years. I don't go anymore. I have in some ways, a kind of complex and conflicted relationship with AA. But what I would say is, kind of don't listen to me. If you're listening to this, you want to go to a meeting and you need to go to a meeting, bloody go, because the science. If you look at this, they did a study in America in the 1990s, and they found of the people that got well into the long term, there were 3 things that played a part. There were 2 of them were therapies, one being cognitive behavioral therapy, the other being motivational interviewing, and the third was some form of support group, peer group. You shouldn't really equate AA with being group therapy, because it's not. It's a support group. Group therapy is slightly different. But all the science shows that your chances of getting well into the long term with other people, working together in a collaborative way, sharing similar problems, working towards similar goals, shoots off the charts when you wind in one of those places. And if you try and do it alone, you'll fail, because no one gets well alone. Nobody. Which is why, Hamish, you've got this wonderful, wonderful community that you have made, and I have immense admiration for it. So it was finally, it was like the theory of the 11th man again. It was my friend was the 11th man who finally said, you have a problem. And finally I could let go and embrace that truth. And then that set me free. And it was hard, but it's been 20 years now. And the thing that powered me into the long term was giving. If you give, you're not a victim. If you give, you're empowered. If you give, then it will transform your life in the most extraordinary of ways. And I'm not suggesting everyone has to become a drug and alcohol counsellor. You can you can give by having a chat with a lonely person. You can give by going and seeing your neighbour or whatever, but giving will set you free for your life.
Wonderful. This has been just a fabulous conversation. It really, really has, and I love the way the 11th man, that is just sticking in my head so profoundly.
You can have that.
I go to absolutely. It's going to be the title of this podcast. Is something on the line of Nick is the 11th man. Yeah.
Sounds
No,
like a fun
truly.
thriller, so it makes me sound kind of more groovy than I am, but yeah.
Yeah. No. Nick, this has been fab. As I said, really, really amazing. Where can people find out more about you? Because I'm sure there's some people who would love to chat with you and shine your torch on their feet.
Yeah, well, there's a link to me my counselling bio. If anyone is looking for somebody helpful to work with, I'm there. And obviously, what I like to do, just to begin with, is just start off with a helpful chat. I don't, so if you just want to get in touch for a helpful chat and see if we can work together, and if I'd be helpful to you, then follow the link. You can find me Nick Shepley on Twitter, where I talk about matters therapeutic, but also a whole bunch of other things. And yeah, that's kind of me.
Fab. Well, we'll put all that information in the show notes because it's very important. And lastly, the question I always like to ask people: what is your superpower that you've got from turning your life around?
Wow. I think it's being there with people, And I'll describe very briefly before we finish what that's like. So sometimes when you are with somebody, a counselling client, and you've made the space that they're in really, really safe for them, and it feels perhaps safer than anything has felt for a long, long time. And they know that you're there to collaborate helpfully with them. They know that you're there to be Gandalf, to say, is it this way or that way? What do you think? And sometimes they feel safe to tell you something. Sometimes it's something really very, very, very dark. And when you tell them, it's okay to say that. It's all right. And it's okay to shed the tears when they tell you it. And they feel safe for the first time to be the person that they really are. Then you can go to a very, very deep place with that person. And you're there not to take a single thing from them. And you're there not even to give anything to them other than time and space. So there you go. It's a two-way street sometimes. It really is.
Isn't it? Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for a really profound conversation. I think this is going to be really interesting, and I'm going to enjoy listening back to this and sharing it with people, because it's been very different to what I normally do, but that's been really profound, and coming from your expertise and your knowledge and just the depth of conversations you've had. You just put such a gentle light on it's okay, basically, isn't it? And it's your choice, and it is better on the other side. Yeah, it may be painful stepping across, but it is a bit easier when you're sober. Yeah.
It is. It's been a real pleasure. I've loved talking, Hamish. I really have.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much, Nick. That's grand. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Crucible, Conversations for the Curious. If these powerful stories of transformation resonated with you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this show with anyone who you think could do with a dose of inspiration for their own journey. I would really appreciate it if you could make any comments on your favourite podcast platform as well. That helps me reach more people. All the important links and information are in the show notes below. Thank you very much for listening, and catch up with you soon.